Good evening again, everybody. I just want to kind of call your attention up here again. Thank you for, in such an orderly manner, taking care of getting your food. One other thing I want to say is if you purchase something at the table, by the kindness of one of our parishioners, Ted Clay, we have copies of the C.S. Lewis book, Screwtape Letters, that will be given out for free, and when they're gone, they're gone. They're pretty much brand new copies, are never touched for the most part. So now it's time to introduce tonight's speaker. Michael Agliotta is a convert to Holy Orthodoxy from the evangelical Protestant world, having been received on Lazarus Saturday of 2021. Additionally, Michael's extended family, including his mother and father and his uncle, have also converted to the faith. All three of those are here as well. With an associate's degree in biblical studies and 4 years studying criminal justice, Michael loves using his analytical side when considering the humanities. Since his conversion, Michael spends much more time reading the lives of saints and learning about Orthodox Christian theology. In the past, he was well read with Protestant authors and was an apologetics teacher, which he admits was at least a little bit off. Okay. He spends a lot more time reading the church fathers now. And yet, there is an author from that old life, right, Michael, that still holds relevance to him. And this author is none other than C.S. Lewis, whom you'll hear more about shortly. Yeah. Like so many other young men and women, the person and writings of Father Seraphim Rose of blessed memory have deeply impressed Michael. And we enthusiastically welcome our dear friend Michael this evening. And we are thankful for the time and research efforts he put into tonight's thoughtful talk about these two men and this most intriguing topic. Okay, that's enough for me. Michael, here you go.
Well, thank you, George, for that overly generous introduction. Well, thank you all for being here, and I am very appreciative of this opportunity to present this information. So, first of all, I did want to answer the question, why these two authors? Well, both men lived very different lives, as we will see. Both are highly respected in their own fields, and they are also both very respected for their prophetic insights, even now after their deaths. Hearing their appraisal of our times from different parts of the globe and from different traditions can inform us of what we ought to be paying attention to and to motivate us to be vigilant. This presentation will be divided up into 3 segments. Segment number 1, introducing our two figures. Segment number 2, taking a look at the two works that we will be analyzing. Segment number 3 will be the collation and the analysis itself. What this presentation will not be is stating who is smarter or who is better. This is not an adjudication. Both of these figures are way smarter than I will ever be, so I couldn't tell you who's smarter even if I wanted to. That being said, let's introduce our figures. First figure will be C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis is a famous 20th century Anglican author whose works conveyed theology strikingly similar to orthodoxy. For example, his view of theosis as a statue coming to life and becoming a human being in Narnia and Mere Christianity. He's known for his fiction, but this presentation we will focus on more of his polemical, argumentative side. Orthodox also appreciate him, such as Jonathan Pageau, Edith Humphrey, and Deacon Nicholas Kotar. Born in 1898 to a good family in Ireland, he was raised as an Anglican, but became an atheist after his mother died. He fought in World War I and was nearly killed by shrapnel, which was permanently stuck in his body for the rest of his life. The war changed him. After the war, he went on to be a professor at Oxford. He was converted to Anglicanism by J.R.R. Tolkien, who was Catholic. He spent much of his time in Renaissance literature and languages. Throughout the 1930s, he was discovering the depths of his newfound beliefs through church fathers like St. Augustine, who influenced his reflections on the Psalms, and St. Athanasius. When On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius was translated into English, C.S. Lewis wrote the preface. He developed a notable respect for patristic Christianity, which can be seen in works like the Space Trilogy, with its emphasis on unfallen worlds, dispassion, and cosmic warfare, as well as his illustrations of eternal generation and theosis in other works like Mere Christianity. He was also in numerous debates and would vigorously attack new modernist philosophies. One of these polemical attacks is what we will be looking at today, the abolition of man. Our next figure will be Father Seraphim Rose. He was born in 1934 into an American Protestant family as Eugene Rose. He studied at Pomona College and the University of Berkeley and was a standout intellect. Like C.S. Lewis, he had a gift for languages. He was well learned in Japanese, Chinese, French, German, and later Russian and Church Slavonic. He loved the classical humanities, such as music like Bach and literature like Dickens and other classic works. He was also very fit and athletic. Despite all of his talents, though, he became unsatisfied with modern life and with the heterodox Christianity he was raised in. He went on a search for capital T truth. He explored Buddhism and other Eastern religions. He also got into New Age spirituality. He became immersed in the bohemian counterculture of San Francisco. He also became deeply inspired by Nietzsche, whose words, quote, resonated in his soul with an electric infernal power, end quote. He became miserable and drunk, grappling with the God who he claimed was dead, pounding on the floor, screaming at him, "Leave me alone." One day, he went to a great and holy Pascha liturgy service at the Russian Orthodox Cathedral of San Francisco. He had an existential revelation that his heart was now home. Through this experience, he learned that the truth is a person and not an idea. He began to pursue Christianity, leaving his old life behind and embracing a new life of asceticism. He was received into the church in 1962. St. John Maximovich nurtured him as he came into the church and into his new life. He also edited some of the saints' works. Side note, Father Seraphim Rose was gay. He was in a gay relationship with another man when he was younger, and he broke it off when he joined Orthodoxy and destroyed his passions. He later withdrew to the wilderness of California near Platina, where he pursued the ascetic life and found much joy in God. It was also during this time in Orthodoxy that he wrote journals and books, some of which include The Journey of the Soul After Death and Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. His writings became very edifying throughout the world. He is one of the greatest religious writers of the 20th century that often goes under the radar in his own home country of the United States. One of his famous quotes is, "Keep your mind in heaven and your feet on the earth." Nihilism was written in 1962. Section 2 of this talk. Let's talk about their works. Up first, The Abolition of Man. This essay was published in 1943 during World War II by Oxford University Press. This essay starts with Lewis analyzing a book that is intended for school students of the upper forms of English, elementary school students. In order to conceal the identities of the authors, he simply calls this book the Green Book, and the authors Gaius and Titius. In actuality, side note, this book is The Control of Language, a critical approach to reading and writing, by Alex King, Gaius, and Martin Kelty, Titius. This book was published in 1940 and can still be found today. In my experience reading this book, it seems to take a deconstructionist approach to language. For example, in Chapter 2, the authors try to separate the referential and the emotive meanings of words. In the third chapter, they argue that what they call, quote, scientific prose are not emotive, but rational. Of course, this is assumed on the basis of the author's arbitrary decision to decide what is rational and what is not, which is what C.S. Lewis will rightly criticize. This book also teaches that when writing a scientific prose, one must avoid rousing, quote, no irrelevant emotions in your reader. We will see how C.S. Lewis tracks this didactic sleight of hand to its inevitable conclusion. Here's how C.S. Lewis critiques the Green Book and uses it to make a broader argument. The first section of the essay is called Men Without Chests. The first part of this essay focuses on debunking the deconstructionist view of classical anthropology in the Green Book. Gaius and Titius make the argument that in the Green Book that a person who is humbled by seeing a waterfall and declares this waterfall as sublime is not really saying anything about the waterfall, but only their own feelings. The Green Book says, quote, this confusion is continually present in language, even as we use it. We appear to be saying something important about something, but actually, we are only saying something about our own feelings. Lewis is going to use this as a springboard for the rest of the essay. Lewis argues that the emotions are not the same thing as what triggers them. Therefore, feelings of veneration cannot be reduced to mere subjective emotions. He argues that if this logic were consistently applied, one would have to go from saying, you are reprehensible to, I have reprehensible feelings. He goes on to say that the child who reads this in the Green Book will believe two things. One, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements of the emotions of the speaker. Two, all such statements are unimportant. He points out that the child who reads this thinks they are doing their English prep when in fact ethics, politics, and theology are all at stake. This relativistic assumption is nested in the student's mind through his youth up into his adulthood. It conditions him to take sides in controversies that he otherwise never would have thought were controversies at all. In the author's efforts to inoculate children against emotional exploitation in literature and propaganda, they have only cut out of his soul the capacity to harbor righteous and just sentiments. With this, Lewis argues that a hard heart is no defense against a soft head. They are still vulnerable to propaganda. The problem with literary criticism that embraces a relativistic philosophy is that it is self-defeating, because it must do so according to an objective standard that is immune to the critical process itself, which has not been justified. Quote, or in other words, if all statements of value are just feelings and opinions, and all feelings and opinions are statements of value, are equally worthless, then why should I trust them? And one might say, well, because I am a professional grammarian and your teacher. But professional and grammarian and teacher are all statements of value. So according to your own teachings, I shouldn't have to listen to anything you say. It is self-defeating. Lewis states that the purpose of education is to train the pupil to conform to the cosmic order and cultivate virtue, to recognize what is highest and training them to reach for it and obey it. This cosmic order, or objective value, he simply refers to as the Tao, for simplicity's sake. Therefore, one who adheres to this Tao can call children delightful and old men venerable, and it is not to simply record a psychological fact about one's feelings, but recognizes it as an actual quality that demands a certain response whether we make it or not. He says, quote, the heart should never take the place of a head, but it should obey it. If sentiments have no correlation to anything real, then there's no reason for them to be there in the first place. thus destroying not only literature, but man's connection to higher principles. This concept is what the rest of the essay will be predicated on. He spends section 2, the Tao, talking about the Tao. This is where he applies this principle to morality, in which he shows us that those who are propagating this relativistic morality really have a morality of their own that is being smuggled in and that we are to obey. However, this morality isn't really a morality at all. It is an ideology. He argues that this path leads to the rejection of all values altogether. In the last chapter, Man's Conquest of Nature, man attempts to control nature or his natural environment and eventually his own nature through eugenics, prenatal conditioning, and by the education system and propaganda. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man, and the battle will have been won. But who precisely has won it? We will stop our abolition of man analysis there, and we will come back to it when we get to the collation. Next will be nihilism. The next work we were going to take a brief look at is Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age. This book analyzes the causes behind the modern breakdown of meaning. What is nihilism according to Father Seraphim Rose? Nihilism is a rebellious faith that is anti-theistic. Nihilism happens in stages. Nihilism matures at different rates in different societies and cultures. So nihilistic manifestation at a specific time doesn't mean that it's specific to that time itself. It could have had its roots in prior centuries. That being said, these are the stages of nihilistic philosophy that Father Seraphim Rose lays out for us. Phase 1, liberalism. This is the idea of a society that is in the process of rejecting its religious roots. People in this society will use words like God, but not in an absolute sense. Liberalism usurps the old God and replaces it with a new one. But this new God isn't actually no God. It's an idea that can be utilized to achieve objectives. Much religious innovation stems from this, the dead God of philosophy. Words like God and heaven become ornaments of language and metaphors, rather than life-governing principles. Truth becomes a means to get what one wants out of this life. The afterlife is minimalized. This essentially leads to atheism, which is the next phase. 2. Realism. Atheistic materialism. The dogma of the Soviets, who did not find God in outer space. The rationalist, like Bertrand Russell, who does not take anything on faith. A radical empiricism that exalts science as supreme. Father Seraphim Rose spends a good amount of time debunking this, but essentially he is saying this. It is a very naive view because it has to subconsciously presuppose things that it consciously denies, like metaphysical categories. Example, Bertrand Russell says, what science cannot tell us, man cannot know. Well, is that a statement of science? No, it's a statement of philosophy. So therefore, it is self-defeating and logically incoherent. Father Seraphim cites St. Basil, quote, "Their condemnation will be greater for all the worldly wisdom. Seeing into vain sciences, they have shut their eyes to the knowledge of the truth." Father Seraphim Rose goes on, where the Christian sees God in everything, the realist only sees race, sex, and mode of operation. Darwinist ideology bolsters this. Heaven has been closed off to the gaze of men, and men have resolved to never take their eyes off the earth and live only for this world. It is disguised as positivism, but it is actually satanic. Next phase, vitalism. Vitalism is a reaction against the eclipse of higher realities that the realist simplification of the world. Vitalism laments the loss of spiritual experiences, thus subjecting itself to spiritual fantasies, leaving it wide open to paganism, New Age spirituality, pseudo-religion, sectarianism, cults, Satanism. Some considered Nazism to be an antidote for the, quote, progress of intellectualism and lifeless academics. The religious experiences caused by drugs like psychedelics are the reductio ad absurdum of these experimental religions. The late thinkers of the 19th century, such as Nietzsche, were the premature children of the disaster of the 20th century. They were trying to find a substitute for the God that died in their hearts. This restlessness has been the chief psychological impetus for vitalism. In summary, liberalism undermines truth by being indifferent to it, yet retaining the prestige of the name. Realism attacks the truth in the name of partial truths, such as scientific truths. And vitalism has no relation to truth. It devotes its concern to something of an entirely different order. Now we move on to the next stage: rebellion, war on God. Pure nihilism is rage against creation until it is reduced to nothingness, the gospel of destruction. Though atheism may seem possible to the philosopher, it is not possible for the whole man. True nihilism is not actually atheistic, it is anti-theistic. The famous 19th century anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon is an example of an anti-theist. He says, quote, "Humanity must be made to see that there is a God, and he is our enemy." Nietzsche says, quote, "Whoever wishes to create must first destroy accepted values." Sergei Nikolaev, who Lenin admired, made this a reality by living a life of unprincipled cruelty under the pretext of total expediency under the aim of the revolution. How does this look in real life? The Bolshevik Revolution was a war to the death against God. But Father Seraphim warns us to be vigilant and to know the ranks of anti-theism are not only occupied by atheists, but those who profess faith in some kind of, quote, God. The war on God is capable of a variety of stratagems, including using the name of God and even Christ. We also recognize that it's defined by its opposition. The psychology of the nihilist is that of a Christian apostate, hence anti-theism. For example, the fruits of the Spirit: peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. The fruits of nihilism: doubt, suspicion, disgust, envy, jealousy, pride, impatience, rebellion, blasphemy. It's a subversive privation. Father Seraphim Rose says, quote, "Unprincipled politics and morality, indiscriminate religious experiences, and undisciplined artistic expression is a result of nihilist rebellion. Nihilism is propagated as the natural state of man. The age of the rebel is at hand. The next stage, the theology of nihilism, the worship of nothingness. Nihilism finds the world absurd and without meaning, and thereby wants to annul creation by returning it to the nothingness from which God created it from, thus imposing an inverted parody of creation ex nihilo with their father, the devil. No man lives without a God. Nothingness is the God of the nihilist, the corpse of a dead God that weighs on him. A void is at the center of man's heart. It is spiritual suicide." Here, Father Seraphim cites another famous 19th century anarchist, Mikhail Bakunin. Quote, "But here steps in Satan, the eternal rebel, the first free thinker, and the emancipator of worlds. He makes man ashamed of his bestial ignorance and obedience, and emancipates him, stamps upon his brow the seal of liberty and humanity in urging him to disobey and eat the fruit of knowledge." That is from Mikhail Bakunin's book, God and the State. In the last chapters of this book, Father Seraphim summarizes the process that he calls, quote, the nihilist program. 1. The destruction of the old order. Quote, Force is the midwife of every society pregnant with a new one, says Karl Marx in Das Kapital. Mikhail Bakunin writes in his work Revolutionary Catechism, while he's in prison, in section G, that violence is necessary. Arousing the base passions for revolution has always been a nihilist practice that serves a function. Nazism had a direct function. Chief Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels explains this function in a radio broadcast in the last days of World War II. He says, quote, "Together with the monuments of culture, there crumble also the last obstacles to the fulfillment of our revolutionary task. Now that everything is in ruins, we are forced to rebuild Europe. In the past, private possessions tied us to a bourgeois restraint. Now the bombs, instead of killing all Europeans, have only smashed the prison walls which kept them captive. In trying to destroy Europe's future, the enemy has only succeeded in smashing its past. And with that, everything old and outworn has gone." End quote. Thus, Nazism for Central Europe did what the Bolsheviks did for Russia, destroying the old order and clearing the way for the new. Second phase of the nihilist program, the making of the new earth. Known in Marxist doctrine as the dictatorship of the proletariat, this includes a second constructive function of violence. Realism in the West and in Eastern Europe have an identical goal: to pursue a new, purely human kingdom liberated from the one true God. In both cases, it's a cold, inhuman world that men without God are fashioning, a world of organization and efficiency rather than love or reverence. We see this in architecture. Lenin wanted the world to be one office, one factory, with equal time, equal pay. Industrialism is to remind men that happiness can only be found in this world, the vastest and most efficient prison the world has ever known. The third phase of the nihilist program, the fashioning of the new man. According to Hitler's propagandist Alfred Rosenberg, a higher humanity is to be forged through creative violence. This is the mission of our century, he says, out of a new life myth to create a new human type. It was not only Nazism that strived to achieve this. For example, Nazism and Marxism both require large-scale alterations in man to achieve their aims. This mass alteration can only take place in revolution. That is to overthrow the ruling class, and the class overthrowing it can only, in revolution, rid itself of its collective past and found society anew. The 30 years of nihilist wars in the 20th century have been the ideal breeding ground for this new human type. Father Seraphim then draws the connection between these dystopian ideals and 20th century art. So it says, Father Seraphim Rose then draws this connection with these dystopian ideas with 20th century art. He says, the image of 20th century sculpture shows us this, quote, new man. The orthodox perception of this art will quickly discover that it is not man being depicted in this art, but some lower creature has emerged from unknown depths. These paintings you see, these pieces of, quote, art, were done by Alberto Gio Macchetti, Jean Dubuffet, and Leon Golub. This is not man in God's image, says Father Seraphim Rose. This new art celebrates the creation of a new species, the creature of the lower depths, subhumanity. The faces are of creatures adjusted to the world that they live in. They are ahuman. Man is dead. Nihilist program in summary: 1. Destruction of the old order, revolution. 2. The making of the new earth, mechanized earth. 3, the fashioning of the new man, the Übermensch, or subhumanity of the depths, as Father Seraphim says. There is much more that could be said about this book and that we could explicate. Father Seraphim Rose wraps up his case with some noteworthy quotes from Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Nietzsche said in 1884, "I am the first to light upon the idea which will divide the history of man in two." He's actually not the first to say this. All Nietzsche did was find words for what was already in the air. 12 years earlier, Dostoevsky predicted this in his novel The Possessed, with his character Karyalov, the most extreme of the possessed. Quote, "Everything will be new. Then they will divide history into two parts, from the gorilla to the annihilation of God, and from the annihilation of God to the transformation of the earth and man physically." So now, let's look at both works. Note, the most helpful way to look at this is to look at these categories not as isolated categories, but rather a network of intersecting correlations. There will be overlap. We are here to look at concepts that are included in the works, not to criticize either author for leaving certain things out. As I'm sure most of you who know these authors know, they've wrote extensively about these things in other works as well. For the sake of time, we will stick to the two works that we have just summarized. Now let's draw together some of their ideas. Correlation number 1, realism and the refashioned man into men without chests. C.S. Lewis identifies the subtlety of relativism when he critiques the Green Book's grammar lesson. Father Seraphim Rose points out that the scientific overshadowing of the humanities in the Victorian era prefiguring 20th century atheism. While both men point out the incoherence of atheism, they don't stop there. They are both aligned in identifying the social engineering that will inevitably follow. Lewis teaches the severing of man's soul from creation by embracing a strictly non-sentimental scientific worldview. Remember the waterfall example. Father Seraphim says, quote, "New man worshiping fact because he has abandoned truth, seeing the world as a vast laboratory where he is free to determine what is possible, the autonomous man, without consciousness of values, at the mercy of the strongest stimulus." End quote. This is what C.S. Lewis would call a man without a chest, or what Lewis would call, quote, the trousered ape or the urban blockhead. What Lewis would call men without chests seems to be very similar to what Father Seraphim would call realism, or the new man, basically an empirical rationalist. Both men reference Nietzsche. Father Seraphim Rose cites the famous "God is dead" quote in Nihilism. This quote is helpful to understand the conclusion of such thought. I'd like to share it before we move on. Quote, "God is dead. We have killed him. You and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon? What did we do when we loosened this sun from its earth? Where does it move now? Do we move away from all suns? Do we not dash on unceasingly in all directions? Is there still an above and a below? Do we not stray as through infinite nothingness? Does not empty space breathe upon us? Has it not become colder? Does not night come on continually, darker and darker?" End quote. Lewis says that, quote, "They can find no ground. To step outside of the Tao is to step out into the void. They are not bad men. They are not men at all." End quote. Father Seraphim says, quote, "The new man will know neither hope nor despair. He is thoroughly adjusted to this new world. He has been denatured." End quote. Both authors show us that atheism isn't just an incoherent idea, but if lived out to its logical conclusion, it will be the end of humankind. This brings us to the next correlation. Correlation number 2, nihilist revolution and the Tao. Father Seraphim points out that revolution not only necessitates violence, but is ultimately self-defeating because it leaves humanity in a worse condition than it started. C.S. Lewis says the following in Part 2 of The Abolition of Man, quote, "The rebellion of new ideologies against the Tao is the rebellion of branches against the tree. If the rebels were to succeed, they would find that they only destroyed themselves. The human mind has no more power to invent a new value than it does to invent a new primary color." What's helpful here is that Lewis points out why the mere attempt at moral innovation is a dead end and a mistake. Father Seraphim vividly illustrates this with concrete historical examples when this mistake is made manifest. One could say the branches killing themselves by rebelling against the tree is the Bolshevik Revolution destroying the old order of Russia, which was nourished them, and they thus turned Russia into a mass grave in the process. Father Seraphim illustrates the result of this rebellion. He says, quote, "A dead God, a void, stands at the center of man's faith. A world once revolving around God now revolves around nothing. Can this be? An order founded upon nothing? Of course not. It is a self-contradiction. It is suicide. But let us not expect coherence from modern thinkers. This is the point modern thought and revolution has reached in our time." Correlation number 3, conquest of nature and the new earth. This is where we left off in The Abolition of Man. C.S. Lewis argues that man's power over nature is really just man's power over other men, and therefore not an advancement for humanity as a whole. For example, he uses the example of eugenics and prenatal conditioning, which is really just power of the generation using it to condition and modify the next generation. Therefore, this, quote, power used by men to make the next generation what they please means that the next generation are the patients of this power. They are weaker, not stronger. They are more controlled, not less controlled. They are the products of the world that has been refashioned by their predecessors, not free agents, as they are told. Father Seraphim outlines this order of operations for this concept. Quote, "Nihilistic realism equals standardization, specialization, simplification, mechanization, dehumanization, reducing the individual to a slave of his environment." Father Seraphim also gives us the example, quote, "For Hitler, the most extreme nihilist, rested on realism, science, progress, enlightenment. He said he had a gift for reducing all problems down to their foundation. He worshipped efficiency, utility that tolerated birth control, and did not appreciate marriage or monasticism." Both men, Father Seraphim and C.S. Lewis, undoubtedly viewed Hitler as a prime example of eugenicist ideology. But Lewis makes a very important point here. He says, quote, when he is writing The Abolition of Man, quote, "I am not thinking solely of our public enemies at the moment," that would be Hitler, "the process which, if not checked, will abolish man goes on a pace amongst communists and Democrats no less than amongst fascists. The method may at first differ in brutality, but many a scientist, dramatist, and amateur philosopher in our midst means just the same in the long run as the rulers of Nazi Germany," end quote. In other words, C.S. Lewis is saying anyone who falls victim to the ideological sleight of hand in the Green Book, Lewis points out that if the seeds of the Green Book are continued to be watered, his people will be no better off than the Nazis that they are currently at war with. The result would be, quote, a world of post-humanity, which some knowingly or unknowingly, nearly all men in all nations are at present laboring to produce, end quote. Bringing us to the next point, correlation number 4, vitalism and the magician's bargain. Father Seraphim contends that realism will eradicate God and leave a spiritual void that will be filled with counterfeit spirituality, since man has already been inoculated against the one true God by realism. He says, quote, in liberalism and realism, the nihilist disease is still relatively superficial, because it's mainly a matter of philosophy and restricted to the intellectually elite. But vitalism does not only develop qualitatively, but quantitatively, because the common people now show signs of nihilism. C.S. Lewis takes an interesting approach in drawing these two concepts together. He writes about what he calls the magician's bargain. In the third part of The Abolition of Man, he equates this to man's conquest for nature and ultimately man's own nature, trading one thing after another for power, and finally himself. He says, quote, the serious scientific endeavor and the serious magical endeavor are twins, born of the same impulse. There is something which unites magic and applied science, while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the problem was how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution was knowledge, discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, end quote. He goes on, modern man may reject magic because it doesn't work for him, but the goal is that of the magician, end quote. This argument is interesting because it practically grounds, or potentially grounds, Father Seraphim's realism and vitalism into the same demonic temptation. Side note, even Orthodox Christianity has never separated technical innovation from the supernatural. Side note continued, even during the Enlightenment and industrial periods where old religion was being thrown away, there were still characters like Jean D, Josephine Paladin, Helena Blavatsky. These were all magicians, mediums, theosophists, which later influenced Nazi Germany, and practitioners of witchcraft. Both Father Seraphim and C.S. Lewis seem to understand the presence of evil spiritual craft driving the development of what Father Seraphim calls mechanized earth and its architects. In conclusion, what Father Seraphim calls refashioned new man, C.S. Lewis would call men without chests. What C.S. Lewis calls rebellion against the Tao, Father Seraphim calls war on God. C.S. Lewis argues that man's conquest of nature is really his conquest of himself through propaganda masquerading as education and other means. The emphasis of C.S. Lewis's attack on the conditioners of this new age and of the new man are at an educational level. Father Seraphim attacks the spiritual paradigm and attacks it at an artistic level. Both men highlight the social degradation that inevitably happens when the conditioners get their way. But they are both pointing to the same problem, just at different levels. Solutions. Both authors posit that the answer is to re-embrace objective capital T truth, but they do so in a different way. C.S. Lewis includes the idea that the solution may come from science itself, but more importantly, he is appearing to take a rational and reason-based approach in this essay, whereas Father Seraphim seems to assert the name of Christ, prayer, and sacraments to change man into his Lord. And being an Orthodox monk, this necessitates the Orthodox Church. While both diagnose the problem, their prescriptions differ slightly from one another. C.S. Lewis is a little bit more vague in this essay, and we would have to dig into some of his other works to get a more precise answer. Father Seraphim Rose, on the other hand, offers us what he already has, namely the ancient truth of the Orthodox Church, lived out. Those of you who are familiar with these authors will have noticed that I did not draw from their other works containing these subject matters. This is due to time constraints, of course. Moreover, I don't feel I've done either work justice due to how much they contain. There is so much more that could be said, but I thank you all for listening to what has been said. From here, we can open it up for discussion.
Thank you.